'Cause there's a side to you that I never knew all the things you say they were never true in the game. You think you would always win, always win. But I said, to the rain, watch it pour as I touch your face. When it burn while I cry, 'cause I heard it screaming out your name.
Hello everyone, today we're gonna talk about a movie named Moonlight. Stephen Grant, a young man, used to live there. Stephen had peculiar sleeping habits. He would not one of his. Because of his peculiar sleeping habits, it appeared like he performed all those things, including stretching his legs and making sure that his flat was completely locked. Every day Stephen worked at a museum by selling trinkets there. He was not an introverted, quiet, and reserved person. The only person who always paid attention to him was a statue at the central area of the city after Stephen finished working. Instead of sleeping, Stephen frequently preferred to spend the entire night reading books or playing Rubik's Cube. When he was asleep, he suddenly found himself dreaming of being in another world. In his dream, a mysterious voice told Stephen to surrender his body to Mark and go back to sleep. "Oh, that was weird. What happened? Where you surrender the body to Mark?" he said, returning to his apartment and repeating all of his peculiar sleeping habits as usual. Stephen was perplexed when he heard that he didn't understand what that enigmatic voice meant, and in the midst of his perplexity, he was suddenly pursued by a group of enigmatic individuals. He fled from them right away and quickly assumed the appearance of one of the locals while watching a cult, which he had no idea what it meant. Was led by a middle-aged man named Arthur Harrow. When Harrow was approached by one of his subordinates, the subordinate informed him that there was an imposter among them because Stephen didn't belong to that group and he was caught by everyone there right away. Strangely, Harrow recognized Stephen's face right away. He said that Stephen was a mercenary. After everyone heard that, they gave Stephen suspicious, hostile glances. Then Harrow asked, in order to give something to Harrow, it appeared as though Stephen's body was being controlled by another person. As a result, Harrow ordered his men to capture Stephen. Then, a strange incident occurred. Stephen briefly lost consciousness before he awoke to find that he had just beaten up all of Harrow's men. He then managed to flee from them by using a truck. They continued until Stephen finally woke up from his sleep. Stephen was relieved to learn that those strange incidents were only dreams when he went outside and discovered that he had been sleeping for a long time. But apparently Harrow's subordinates were still chasing him. The same strange incident then occurred. Stephen lost his consciousness for a split second and found himself had beaten up one of Harrow's subordinates in the next second. The phone, he could hear a lady calling and yelling at him. Mark. Then the call cut short. Stephen heard another eerie voice calling his name as he was walking toward the source. He was surprised to discover that the eerie voice was coming from a mirror that was hanging on the wall of his bathroom. Stephen then made the decision to flee as a result, and he saw a frightening-looking creature pursuing him. He then screamed and realized what had happened. After that, Stephen went to the museum to work as usual, but surprisingly, he ran into Harrow there. He immediately called the security guard, but it turned out that security guard was one of Harrow's followers. Suddenly, Stephen found himself in a difficult situation. He was surrounded by Harrow and many of his followers, and their goal was still the same. They wanted to steal the scarab from Stephen. This time, the voice revealed his body, which was visible in the bathroom mirror. Although his physical appearance was identical to Stephen's, the voice claimed that he was Mark, a man who had been targeted by Harrow and had also saved Stephen when he was being pursued by Harrow's followers. Mark then instructed Stephen to surrender his body if they wanted to survive, and as soon as Stephen's body was taken, Stephen turned hostile. Moonlight used his powers to kill that frightening-looking beast. It came out that Stephen had dissociative identity disorder and had a second different personality identity called Mark. He was a Mark. That was a brief explanation of the relationship between Mark and Steven. The following day, Steven woke up and discovered that he had returned to his apartment. As he arrived at the museum, he asked his friend to guide him to a control room to determine whether what had happened to him the previous evening was real or not. Steven informed his friend that he had received a superpower from Khonshu, son of the god of the moon. Since Steven had destroyed some facilities and property at that museum, he was ultimately fired from his job. Subsequently, Steven was searching for an apartment that had the key that matched with the key that he had found in his apartment. He was told that it was Mark's apartment, and when Steven arrived at the building, he was instructed to go to a storage unit. Mark then appeared via the mirror reflection with Harrow inside the bag. When Steven learned that Mark had declined to submit his body because he had to complete a crucial assignment at the moment, Steven opted to flee instead. When Steven emerged from that storage area, he was stopped by Khonshu, who instructed him to deliver his body to Mark. When he was able to escape that building, Steven approached him but refused to give over his body, leaving. A lady there, it appears the lady was Mark's wife. She phoned Steven on the phone the day before, and her name was Layla. When Layla and Steven arrived to Steven's apartment, he informed her that he wasn't Mark and showed her the items in Mark's suitcase, including the scarab that he had discovered there. Initially, Layla felt that Steven was Mark, but she later changed her mind. Layla was still waiting for Steven to finish describing everything when two investigators arrived at his flat, forcing her to climb the wind of the hideout doors. When those two detectives discovered Mark's passport in Steven's apartment, they suspected that Steven was attempting to forge his identity. They then handcuffed Steven and took him somewhere, but it turned out that those two detectives weren't actually police officers but rather were Harrow's followers, because when Mark later showed up and ordered Steven to surrender his body, Steven refused. Around the village with him. As they walked around the village, Harrow revealed to Steven that he was once a conscious subordinate like Mark, but that one day Harold made the decision to stop worshipping Khonshu in favor of the goddess Ammit. As a result of this decision, Harold needed the scarab to be used as a compass to locate the goddess Ammit and bring her back to life. Harrow then asked Steven to give the scarab to Harold, but Steph refused. Layla instructed Steven to put on his costume right away because she still believed that Steven was Mark, who had a superpower, when she begged him to go with her. They were running because Steven was still unsure of everything when a wild animal sent by Harrow suddenly attacked him. However, due to the wild animal attack, Steven was able to finally change into Mark's Moonlight costume, even though his Midnight costume emerged slightly from Mark's Middle Night costume. Wearing that Moonlight costume, Steven made an odd attempt to defeat the wild animal, using only his hands. Madman. Do you think having a signature is important? After failing to combat that wild beast, Steven decided to give Mark his body so he could rescue himself. Mark then used his superpower to assault and quickly kill the wild animal. After that, Mark realized he had misplaced the scarab. After Mark had taken over Steven's body and refused to give it back to Steven, he decided to use Steven's body to carry out the mission that Khonshu had given him. A few times later, Mark finally made it to Egypt. He went there because he was looking for Harrow and wanted to stop Harrow. Harrow discovered the scarab and took it with him. When Mark was trying to find Harrow, Harrow's subordinates stopped him. Mark then used them to get information about the whereabouts of Harrow and his followers, but apparently Harrow's subordinates were very faithful to Harrow. They preferred to die rather than revealing the secret information about raising the goddess Ammit from her dead. At the same time, Harrow and his followers had arrived at the site of the tomb of the goddess Ammit. When the trial finally started, Mark Commander was conversing with a follower of the goddess of music named Yatzil. After Khonshu took control of Mark's body, he accused Harrow of attempting to unleash the goddess Amuse. As a result of Khonshu's accusation, Harold was called to give his evidence in that trial. The trial would be held in a pyramid with the gods and goddesses serving as the judges. Finally, the Avatar trial was over. After the trial concluded, Yatzil visited Mark and instructed him to locate a tomb belonging to a person that had been the target of all the charges made by Khonshu. who was aware of the location of the Godzamite tomb in the city Markham, was among the crowd when Layla spotted him and offered to assist. She then drove him to meet Anton Mogart. Because Layla was Anton's acquaintance, he knew she was on the tomb. Mark's lack of historical knowledge made it impossible for him to uncover any clues, so Anton let Layla and Mark have a close-up look at his tomb and then assigned Steven to handle that task after noticing Mark. Harrow suddenly appeared and incited Anton to hate Mark and Layla before using his ability to take the sarcophagus there, after which Harrow departed that location. As Mark and Layla began to act suspiciously, he sent his security personnel to arrest them. Once the battle with Anton and his subordinates was over, Steven took control of Steven's body to search for the answer using the clues they had previously deciphered. Fortunately, Layla was able to steal some clues before Harrow stole the sarcophagus. After they solved a small clue, Khonshu and Moonlight combined their powers to alter the sky. Anton and his subordinates were about to attack Mark and Layla. When Khonshu left, Steven lost his superpower and fell unconscious right away. Harrow was being brought by one of the gods who had imprisoned Khonshu. The hero was relieved when he found him because they needed to match their clues with the constellations at that time. Unfortunately, the gods and goddesses were angry because of what Khonshu was doing, so they decided to punish Khonshu by locking him up inside of a rock. Because Steven was still unconscious, Layla had to figure out how to survive on her own so she could protect Steven and herself. Fortunately, Layla was used to dealing with such difficult situations, so she immediately hid inside a car to devise a strategy to fight Harrow's underlings. She took dynamite from that car and threw it to the car of Harrow's underlings. After that, Steven recovered from his fainting, and he and Layla stole a car and wrote. Before they discovered the goddess's coffin, they discovered that the tomb was constructed like a labyrinth with a shape resembling the Eye of Horus. They also discovered that there was a lot of blood from a recent event and human remains on one side of the tomb. Steven and Layla then went their separate ways to find a way out of that labyrinth. When they were walking in their separate ways, an Egyptian priest suddenly entered that tomb carrying a body of a dying. After Layla and Steven became separated, Layla ran as fast as she could until she almost fell into an abyss. She was trying to cross the abyss by walking on a narrow bridge at the side of the abyss, but unfortunately, when Layla almost arrived on the other side, the Egyptian priest discovered and caught her. Layla thought that Egyptian priests with everything, so she helped Layla to run away from that place by distracting the Egyptian priests. After that, Harrow informed Layla. In addition to expressing his admiration for her, he addressed Layla's late father, Abdullah al-Falai. When Harrow told Layla that Mark was one of the mercenaries who killed her father, Layla wasn't immediately convinced by what the hero had said, but she couldn't deny that it was possible if it were true. Furious, Layla left that location and went in search of Steven. When Steven arrived at Alexander the Great's tomb, he discovered the statue of the goddess inside of Alexander the Great's throat. Steven was relieved. Was no longer able to use his ability, and after being struck in the chest by Harrow, he eventually passed out. Then, out of the blue, Mark awoke in a room filled with light, where he saw Harold, who pretended to be Mark's psychiatrist. Mark, who was perplexed by everything, fled from the room and hid inside a different one. While there, he discovered a coffin and witnessed Steven emerging from it for the first time in their lives. Mark and Steven eventually crossed paths in different bodies after that. They then left the room with the intention of escaping. However, as they were fleeing, they came across a mysterious animal that resembled a hippopotamus. Apparently, that mysterious creature was the cause of their encounter. A god known only as the goddess Terra explained that she was tasked with helping the dead spirits by guiding them into the afterlife. Mark didn't believe with everything that the goddess tower had said, so he still tried to escape from that place by opening a door there. After he opened that door, he saw a different Panora. After he saw that door, he saw a different Panora. The goddess tower took Mark and Steven's hearts and placed them on a scale. She was puzzled by the outcome of their waiting because the scale wouldn't stop teetering. Then she realized that this thing happened because Mark and Steven were Mark and Steven, and the ancient ship would take them to their final destination, which was heaven or hell, and their final destination was very much depending on the result of their waiting. They walked inside a room and discovered numerous corpses there. Evidently those corpses were individuals who had been murdered by Mark. Surprisingly, there was a young child who was alive among those corpses. When Mark and Steven eventually returned to the building, Steven observed several rooms there and understood that each of those rooms represented a piece of their memories. They went outside and spotted a young boy who was alive among those corpses. Because Steven was interested about the little child, he immediately ran after a boy. Steven was wondering if Mark also killed that little boy, and if he did, he was intrigued as to why. As though he didn't want Steven to learn about, Mark attempted to stop Steven. The location's reality. Steven was surprised to learn that the little boy he had previously met was apparently his younger brother because, as far as he could recall, he had never had a younger brother in his life. Then, Steven saw them entering a cave to play and followed them there. Suddenly, it began to rain heavily, and as a result, the cave began to slowly fill with water. This caused Steven to panic. Of a room, there was a funeral inside of that room. Turned out to be the funeral of Mark's younger brother who died because he drowned in the cave. As a result of that tragedy, Mark's mother was furious at Mark. She blamed Mark for the death of his brother and said that Mark had failed to protect his brother. Mark's mother was still angry at Mark and blaming him for the death of his brother even years after the tragedy took place. The little Mark was sick of his mother's accusations. At an instant, they were in another location, where they discovered the body of Layla's father, who had been killed by Mark's colleague there. Mark may have also been shot by his colleague while attempting to flee the scene to protect himself. Since Mark had no other options, he accepted the god Khonshu's offer of assistance and began to transform into Moonlight. Mark and Steven then returned to the location of the goddess, where a strange incident occurred. Mark suspected that the incident was related to the god Khonshu, but he was unable to confirm it. He prayed with the goddess' heart to revive him and Steven from the dead so they could stop Harrow, the goddess, who was the one behind all of this. Before they could be raised from the dead, Tara advised them to balance their scale first. The teetering scale revealed that Steven and Mark were still covering up something from one another. When Mark learned this, he asked Steven to travel back with him to the setting of their memories. There, they saw the young Mark crying in his room because he felt sad and frustrated over being treated poorly by his mother because of that upsetting and traumatic feeling. Steven was one of the numerous different personality identities Mark established. Steven was made by Mark. Steven was shocked to learn that while he had believed himself to be an ordinary person, Mark had actually created him as a personality. Because of this, he had never known that he had a younger brother and had always believed that his mother was a good person. When Mark and Steven ran out of time, they went back to the goddess's location as the goddess. This helped Steven deal with the trauma of his mother's unfair treatment of him. Shipped to transport Mark and Steven. When the scale in Steven and Mark's heart stopped moving, it meant that Mark would be taken to heaven. When Mark arrived in heaven, he kept thinking about Steven and felt that he didn't deserve to be there. Unfortunately, Steven fell from the ship. He quickly got to his feet and tried to chase that ship, but his body was difficult to move, and he was slowly turning into a stone. A miracle occurred. In the mortal world, the hero finally found the statue of the goddess Ammit. After he found that statue, he became more powerful than he was before after everyone had left that place. When the gates of Osiris opened, turning Steven and Mark back into humans, they ran toward the gates as quickly as they could because a sandstorm was coming to that place. Due to Mark's murder, Layla emerged from concealment and approached Mark, who was laying dead on the ground. Layla was resolved to get revenge on Harrow by killing him with her own hands, while Harrow and his men, who were on their way to increase. Layla had been hiding in one of the cars used by Harrow and his subordinates. She had prepared her knife and was ready to kill Harrow right away when suddenly the goddess intervened where it took over one of the Egyptian policemen's bodies and stopped her. However, because Harrow had grown too powerful, he was able to easily remove the souls of those policemen from their bodies. After that, Harrow and his followers came at the Pyramid of the Gods and the Goddesses. The gods and the goddess had attempted to stop Harrow, but were unable to do so since Harrow had become too strong. Harrow and his followers were preoccupied with themselves at the time. In order to find and free the god Khonshu, Layla sneaked into that location. When she found the statue of the god Khonshu, she broke it, releasing the god Khonshu immediately. At the same time, Harrow finally succeeded in freeing the Gazimus. When the goddess Ammit was freed, she asked Harrow to become her avatar. Soon after, the god Khonshu arrived there and attempted to fight the goddess Ammit because the god Khonshu had been imprisoned. Khonshu, who was alone, was unable to defeat the goddess, while Tara, who was also alone, rescued Stephen and Mark as they fled the sandstorm. The god Khonshu was being cornered by the goddess Ammit when he suddenly felt the presence of Mark there. He then looked for Mark and gave him back his Moonlight superpower as soon as he found him, believing that there was still some hope for them. Stephen and Mark eventually managed to enter the gates of Osiris and returned alive. While remaining inside the pyramid, Layla saw a god and a goddess. The god informed Layla that they needed to. The goddess helped Layla by creating Layla as her avatar, after which Layla had become an official avatar with new appearance and superpower. While at the top of the pyramid, Harrow began to perform his ritual. He began to take the souls of people there from their bodies to make the goddess Ammit become more powerful. After that, God said that he finally died to complete that mission. The goddess to where it helped Layla by making Layla as her avatar. After that, Layla had officially become an avatar who had new look and superpower. Mark lost consciousness during that fierce bout, but when he regained himself, he saw that he had vanquished Harrow. The fact that they had defeated Harrow meant that they had another personality who had assisted them in doing so. They then took Harrow's body to the pyramid and performed a ritual to lock the god of salmon up. As a result of that ritual, which caused the goddess Ammit to be drawn into and trapped inside of the body of her own avatar. The god Khonshu then requested that Mark kill Harrow, but Mark was perplexed by the situation. When Mark awoke from his sleep, he was in Stephen's apartment. This meant that he had resumed his previous life and stopped changing into a god avatar. Inside the car, Harrow saw the god Khonshu, who was prepared to kill him. The god Khonshu had been waiting in that car with his new avatar named JJ was there because the god Khonshu had heard that he had finally granted what Mark had wished. And the movie ends here. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.